Well, good morning, folks. Let's start class. We'll begin with a prayer. Gracious and loving God, thank you so much for a lovely Lord's Day, a time to worship you, a time to think of you. I also pray that you speak to us in this class and inspire us to serve you in the world. I pray all these things now in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, today we're going to talk about Sea of Galilee stuff, which I just love to do. It's really one of my favorite topics, one of my favorite places. And I want to talk about it through the lens of John chapter 21. So if you've got a red or black Bible, the table Bible, John 21 is on page 883. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that this class is about John chapter 21 because it's unique in John's gospel. I want to do a quick comparison of the four, if you will, or the first three and then the fourth so that you can understand the drama of what I'm trying to present here with John chapter 21. First of all, the first three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels, which means that they're seen with the same eye. Synoptic, it's got optic within it, or the same point of view. It means that almost the entirety of Mark can be found within Matthew and Luke. Matthew has some additional information that someone remembered. Luke has some additional information that someone remembered. But the shape of it is the same. The shape of Mark is the shape of the first three. So that means that the Passover becomes the lens or the paradigm or the shape of the story as Jesus travels to Jerusalem and becomes the Passover lamb. It's the first three. The fourth is different. Fourth gospel is different. So the first three were also the earliest accounts of the story of Jesus, with Mark being written around the year 70, about the time of the destruction of the temple. John's gospel is written around the turn of the first and the second century, so they've had some more time to reflect on the identity of Jesus. It's written in a different place to a different audience, to Greek-speaking Roman people who are steeped in, for instance, the Greek philosophies like Plato, the concept of logos, so the word. Now John's gospel takes that very Greek idea and it says that the word now has become flesh. In other words, they process differently, they think differently, just like we might think differently now on this side of the pandemic than we did on the other side of the pandemic. I mean, the word quarantine didn't mean anything to me 3.5 years ago. Boy, it sure means something to me now, right? And so you, or masks or anything else that we would not even imagined just a short while ago in our lifetimes seems like a lifetime. By the time you get to the writing of John's gospel, a lot has taken place. The temple has been destroyed. Christianity is beginning to spread out into the world in places far, far away from the place where Jesus lived. And so John's gospel is descriptive, if you will, in a way that the other three are not, because the first three can assume that you knew about this place behind me. That's one way that it's different. Another way that the fourth gospel is different is that it's an urban gospel. The first three gospels, over half the gospel takes place on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. I'll show you a picture where I drew the highlighter there. That's where over half of the first three take place. John's gospel takes place largely in Jerusalem. As I've said, the first three, the paradigm for the first three gospels would be the Passover story. Well, the paradigm for the fourth gospel is another festival. There were three festivals in Jerusalem at the time. There was Passover in the spring, and then Pentecost 50 days later. Penta means 50, and then Sukkot in the fall. And Sukkot is the fall festival that Jesus attends and John remembers again and again and again through the lens of water. At Sukkot, by the way, the priest would, on the final day of the festival, take water from the pool of Siloam and ascend the Temple Mount and pour this water on the altar, praying for winter rains so that the crops would grow and they wouldn't die over the winter. And they called that water living water. And Jesus would call himself living water, which is the name of this class and my podcast, which is released on every Monday. So if you haven't picked up on that yet, you can also catch other episodes of what we're talking about. We're looking at the Bible stories through the lens of this water. Okay, now with that build up, I will tell you that the Sea of Galilee is very, very important to the gospel story. It's actually key to the gospel story. So you've got over half the first three gospels taking place on the northwest shore of the lake. And for some of you who have been students of mine for some time now, can you tell me why it all takes place there? Anybody want to hazard a guess? Because that's where the fish are. Exactly. The fish are on the shallow part of that lake, and the grass grows there. And so the fish that they catch is an algae-eating tilapia. Not like the tilapia you get at Publix. A little more robust than that. It's an African tilapia, and it's a very, very good fish. But you have to catch it with nets. It doesn't eat anything but stuff off of grass. And so the Bible accounts of the fishermen are exactly the way that they would fish in those days. Today, what they'll do is they'll drop monofilament down and with weighted, almost like a trot line or a gill net, and just whatever swims through it and gets stuck, they come back 6 hours later and they pull it up and they pull out all the fish they want and they throw away the fish that they don't want. And it's remarkably similar to the cast nets of the fishermen of Galilee, which means that the gospel story is about real people doing real things, fishing, paying bills, paying their taxes, raising their families, living in towns that you can find on a map today. But John 21 is a mystery. Now, see, you've already been educated, right? You know the difference between the first three and then the fourth. You already know that the first three are pastoral and the fourth gospel is urban. You already know that. And yet, the final chapter of John's gospel takes place here. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that it has been a mystery, and we're going to solve it today, or we're going to attempt to solve it. It has been a mystery. Why does John's gospel end at the lake? So I went to seminary in the early 1990s, which means that at my seminary, my professors had been educated in the 60s, and it was very fashionable to deconstruct things. They loved to freak us out, especially us little Alabama kids, to just kind of give us something shocking, like King David may have never existed. And I'm like, no, don't tell me that. When actually, archaeologically, we found King David's house in Jerusalem. Okay, so we're, it's fun. I think the reason why I get so passionate about the field of biblical archaeology is because over the last decade or so, scientists are beginning to confirm that the people who wrote the Bible knew exactly what they were seeing and who they were talking about, and so that the pages of Scripture are coming alive in the rocks of the Holy Land today. Same thing happened with John 21. I remember clearly one of my professors said, well, it just must have been a misplaced story. Somebody just found a scrap of a Galilee story and just stuck it on the end. Because in John 21, they're fishing again. And this is a post-Easter account. This is the last chapter of an urban story that rarely takes place in the Galilee, and yet the final chapter, the boys are fishing, and Jesus meets them with breakfast and a charcoal fire. Let's read the story, and then I'll see if we can unpack the mystery. So this is John 21. It's page 883. Any of you that just walked in, if you want to grab a Bible, don't be shy. The red Bible there, you can do page numbers, or you can listen to me read excellently. All right. After these things, Jesus showed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias. Okay, Sea of Galilee, Sea of Tiberias, same thing. And he showed himself in this way. Gathered there together were Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathanael, Cana of Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 others of his disciples. And Simon Peter said to them, I'm going fishing. They said to him, we'll go with you. And they went out and they got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, Children, you have no fish, have you? They answered him, No. He said to them, Cast the net to the right side of the boat, then you'll find some. So they cast it. Now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. And when Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. And thank you, Peter, for that favor, right? I can only imagine. Oh, yeah, right. But the other disciples came into the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far off from the land, only about 100 yards off. And when they'd gone ashore, they saw a charcoal fire there with fish on it and bread. And Jesus said to them, Bring some of the fish that you've caught. So Simon Peter went and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them, although there were so many the net was not torn. And Jesus said to them, Come and have breakfast. Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, Who are you? Because they knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. Now this was the 3rd time that Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. Okay, it's Easter, and they're fishing, and they're eating breakfast. So let's see if we can't solve the mystery of why John's gospel ends with this scene. The first one is found in the place itself. So the Bible doesn't say this anywhere. I've looked everywhere for this statement. But the Bible does not say the Sea of Galilee was one of the prettiest places you'll ever find on the earth. It doesn't say this. I wish it did. It just says the Sea of Galilee because in the Hebrew language of the time, they didn't have a word for any large body of water except for sea. It's not a sea, it's a lake. And it's not a very big lake, although it's an impressive lake. We'll use this room to imagine the Sea of Galilee for just a minute. And I'm standing in the north and looking at the south, so most of the Gospels will take place from where I'm standing at Bethsaida all the way to the corner, which would be Magdala, with Capernaum in the middle. Those should all be names that you've heard of before. Mary Magdalene, Capernaum, the feeding of the 5,000. All that happened right here in a 10-mile arc from where I'm standing. So, okay, that. When I'm looking south, it's 11 miles long and it's 7 miles wide. And when Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount, which would be about right here, okay, would be right. He said, a city on a hill can't be hid, which means that the sun would set from east to west and in the afternoon shines down on it. And there was a city where that clock is on the wall up on the top of the ridge called Hippos, and it was painted white and it would gleam. So when Jesus said a city on a hill can't be hid, he's looking at a city on a hill that can't be hid. It glows. We use stuff all around him. The reason why that light is so pretty, I took that picture a month ago. So I took my son in January, and winter's a really pretty time to be there because of the moisture in the air. So what happened was sunrise was about, like it is about here, sunrise was about 6 a.m., but for about 45 minutes before sunrise, you get this ambient light because the Sea of Galilee, it almost glows. It's luminescent because it sits in a bowl. It's 800 feet below sea level. It's the lowest freshwater lake on earth. It's part of a rift in the earth called the Great Rift Valley that runs from Ethiopia all the way into Syria. And so it's just a crack between two tectonic plates, which is why Turkey had a big earthquake, because there's a cost for living in such a seismic area where all the continents come together. 1 mile north of this lake, 1 hour north of this lake, 1 hour's drive north of this lake, are the continents of Europe and Asia on either side of the Jordan River, and you're in Africa right here. So it's a fascinating place, but that's why it's so seismic. So because it sits in a bowl, it gets this ambient light both at sunrise and sunset, and it just glows, and the colors are amazing. I just snapped that right outside of my hotel room, right, and saying my prayers. What a place to say your prayers, by the way. It doesn't say anywhere in Scripture, and Jesus lived in the most beautiful place on planet Earth. Okay, here's a picture of me and Edan, a couple of knuckleheads, standing by the lake. Let's see if I can get to come up. There we are. But see how cool the light is? I mean, ignore the two gents in the picture. Just notice how the wind kicks up really quickly, just like the Bible would say that it would when they're on the boat, straining in the oars against an adverse wind. If you're a fisherman in the Galilee, you don't get out in that. But unfortunately, you can be out when the lake is like glass. And that can happen. And of course, this happens in Scripture when Jesus stills the storm. So the first thing I want to say to you is that John 21 feels right to me. I'm going to go back to that picture because I like it. John 21 feels right to me because we all have a place, or I hope that we have a place, where we see God. I'm working on a sermon for Ash Wednesday, and I'm sort of working on the idea about being whole people, and we must have a job, and we must function, and we must be practical, but we also need a sense of wonder. And yet at the same time, we can't keep our head in the clouds all the time, right? But I hope there are those times when we have wonder that interrupts our worlds. So for instance, when we go to the beach or to the mountains, I hope that we're not merely seeing valuable real estate or resources to be harvested or anything practical. I hope that when we go to the mountains or the beach, we see God. And it's really okay to feel God. People will almost apologize to me. They'll say, Rich, I just want you to know I really like you, and I really like St. Luke's, but man, the lake is pretty this time of year. I'm thinking, that's okay. I mean, listen, with streaming now, we really can have it all. I want you to consider, especially as we begin to vacation this year, we have an opportunity now to stay more connected with our church family than ever before. If it's not a podcast like this class, we also stream our services. And I don't know if y'all have compared St. Luke's camera quality, but Janella has become like a producer. And Janella and Henry both have like angles, right? And the scripture kind of comes up like Star Wars, kind of comes up on the screen. And it's really good stuff. And I say this because I think we're in a new world, right? With new opportunities to stay more connected than ever before, even as we enjoy these places. I hope you always have a place. My point is I'm trying to say that Jesus appeared after Easter at the Sea of Galilee because this was their place. Even today, Galileans living there they love it. I mean, every day is an adventure. Every day is a play of light and color, and it's gorgeous. In a world with very little water, it's a mesmerizing scene to look at the Sea of Galilee every day. I'm trying to tell you, it's just a pretty place, right, to go back to. Why would he stay in Jerusalem when he could go back to this? And many of you who've traveled with me to Israel will say, almost without exception, that Jerusalem is important. You need to see it. Absolutely. This is where the crucifixion and the resurrection happened. All the drama, all the stories of the kings of Judea, all that important stuff happened. But Galilee, Galilee, that's the place you dream of. That's the place you go back to. Galilee, Galilee. So this is where they're from. Also think that at some point, again, I've said it, but I'll hit this again. We can't stay on the mountain all the time. And after the resurrection, it was just time to go back to living again. It feels right to me that Peter and the disciples would go back to their homes, back to their families, and back to their boats, because that's what they do, right? Some of you have been to Curcio in our diocese, and I hope everybody will go. It's a renewal weekend, a retreat weekend at Camp McDowell. It's pretty wonderful. And I went a long time ago because I'm very old. But I remember Bishop Stow spoke to me one time, and I said something about, boy, it's hard to go back to the real world after I've been at Curcio all weekend. And Bishop Stow said, Rich, Curcio is the real world, meaning that you can take the love of God with you now back to your work. You can take this transformed, spirit that you've got in your heart, this expanded love, or whatever it might be. We've all had those kinds of experiences, right? Maybe a mountaintop or a retreat or something. They're the best when they can make you different when you go back to the office, when you go back to where you are. Things are the same, but they're not the same, right? Things that have a little more color to them. And so again, it just feels right that they would return to work, because that's what we do. So the place is one clue, but there's another clue, and it's found in the text. And I want you to look back at John chapter 21, and I'm going to read verse 4 to you again. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you? Children, you have no fish, have you?" I have had an opportunity. Some of you all heard this story, so I won't belabor it too much. But I've had an opportunity to fish on the Sea of Galilee, so I know about it. So a few winters ago, it was pre-COVID, I had an opportunity to go out on the water for 6 hours with 2 Galilean fishermen. And they spoke nary a word of English. We set this thing up kind of on the fly, because in the Galilee, everybody knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy who knows a guy. I was picked up at 5:30 in the morning by 2 men in hoodies and a smoky Russian car, and the only English they knew was they said, "Get in." That's all, right, and it's dark outside. Hey, what can go wrong? So I'm out on the water, and they finally figured out that I'm handy with oars, and so I was able to keep the boat steady while they pulled the stuff up. Suddenly, in the middle of our work, Menachem, no, it was Momi. Momi and Michel. Momi, which is short for Solomon. Momi sees someone has dropped a net in his turf. You see, when Jesus said, "Drop your net on the other side," there's schools of these fish just kind of going around. They're not all in one place. You got to find them. And so some places are better than others. And so these fishermen know where the shoals are and where the grass might be and how shallow it might be. So someone has dropped their net, and they're over there retrieving said net. And so Momi lets out a torrent of profanity in the Hebrew language, and I don't understand exactly what he's saying, but I don't have to know from the tone of it. And so we pull up our nets and we roar over to the spot so that I can hold the boat steady so that Momi can throttle him and grab him by the neck, right, and start wailing on his head because he dropped his net in the wrong place. It's one of the coolest things I've ever done. And then, while this is going on, they have these boats for pilgrims. And this is, by the way, those of you who've been with me, you'll get on one. It's corny fun. If you hadn't been, it's just something you ought to do. It's called a Jesus boat. And it's just a tricked out deck boat. It looks like a Sea of Galilee. It's something from the 1st century, but beneath it, inside of it, it's a Lake Martin boat. Okay, and it goes very slow, and there's a deck there so the pastor can read the Bible and you can have devotions. It's really a lot of fun, and it's a nice way to see the water. while while I am participating in this throttling of someone who put their net in the wrong place, a Jesus boat is gliding by, and we're ruining their morning devotion. Here's the clue to the text. Children, you have no fish, have you? They don't say children. They don't say children. I know these boys. They don't talk like that. Because my takeaway from my fishing experience was that this is exactly the kind of people Jesus called. These were the people that Jesus found, right? These are his people, and they don't say children. They're rough cut men. Now the King James version doesn't help us any better. The King James says lads. They didn't say that either. I'm just telling you, that's like the little English schoolboys, right? Lads, no fish, lads, children. And so I went back to the original language, which is Greek, and looked at the tenses. The word is called paideia. And the biblical commentators have just had a hard time translating this word because they hadn't been fishing with Momi and Michelle. Okay? If I could get my hands on some biblical scholars and take them to meet my boys down by the lock, then you would see that the word is really better translated boys. Boys. You know, we Southerners kind of know how to do that, right? Not in a belittling way, a patriarchal way. Just, hey, boys, y'all caught any fish? One time I was in New York City. I was a young person with a very funny friend from Chattanooga, and we got in a cab, and the cab driver and his brother were in the front seat, and they were Sikh, you know, with those headdresses, you know, the big whiskers, the head Sikhs, yeah, they're Sikhs. And my buddy from Chattanooga said, "You boys belong to a lodge somewhere?" Okay, so, right, boys. I mean, hey, boys, have you caught any? In other words, this is another clue to the text. They went back to this place because it's beautiful and it's where they're from, and then also they're in relationship with Jesus there because they're his boys. They're his boys. They're guys. I mean, Peter was naked and on that boat, and this is real life stuff. We're the ones who have stained glassed our faith up so much that we make it distant from the rocks and the earth and the mud and the work and the friendship and the kidding and the teasing and the relationship and just the stuff of living, right? They were his boys, and they were fishing again, and they weren't catching anything. And drop your net on the other side, and what a delight in a miracle again, just like the old days. Everything's the same, but it's not the same anymore. I think that's my hope and my prayer for all of us, is that somehow St. Luke's can also be that kind of place. We've got places, and maybe it's the mountains, and maybe it's the beach, and maybe it's the lake, but maybe this can also be that kind of place where you always come here just a little better than when you went in, just a little lighter, where the office suddenly is the same, but it's not the same. You see where I'm going? Now, I want to tell you some more Sea of Galilee stories while we're here. Now that I've convinced you that this is exactly where this needs to be, the third time Jesus appears to them, I'll tell you a cool Sea of Galilee story. So, all right, let's go back to this. I don't have my pointer, but if you look at the top of the lake, so now we know the geography, north, south, east, west. At the very top, at the end of my little yellow mark, is a place called Bethsaida. Except they haven't found it, at least until the COVID lockdown. In the summer of 2020, they found it. Now, what they would tell you, and I've been taking groups for a long time, so what we used to say is, well, I can take you to Magdala, I can take you to Capernaum, and I can get you close to Bethsaida, but we don't know. Because across the road from the shore of the lake, there was some form of Bethsaida that was older than Jesus, and then also a form of Bethsaida that was newer than Jesus, but we didn't have anything from the first century until the COVID disruption, when archaeologists and scientists had nothing else to do because there were no pilgrims and no tours and no work, and they found it in the rocks and the mud, just where the Bible said it would be. So what this is down by the shore of the lake is the place where Peter and Andrew were from, where Jesus healed a blind man. It's here. Now, actually, what you're seeing there in that column is a Byzantine church, or a 5th century church that they built to commemorate Bethsaida. And it's kind of neat when you're doing the business of archaeology, the business of finding things in the world of Jesus. Oftentimes, it would be a church that will be your first clue. If the late Romans were working off of an oral memory, if you will, they're working off of oral tradition, and they build a worship place there, oftentimes you can start to peg that as the place. The way it happened was simply this. Constantine, the Roman emperor, made Christianity the glue that would hold his empire together in the early 4th century. Or it would happen gradually, but it would become the religion of the Roman Empire. And then what we call late Romans, Byzantine would not be a word that they would even understand themselves to be referred to, but rather they would simply see themselves as Roman people. But going 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, kind of going forward there, Roman people, as best I can suppose, is they took their impulse towards monumental architecture, altars to pagan gods, public monuments to emperors, that sort of thing. Romans loved to build monumental things within their cities. That same impulse simply became translated into churches. They just simply took that desire to build beautiful buildings, and they became houses of worship. What formerly would have been the same energy poured into a public temple, right? And then they did that for two reasons. It's that, and then the other one is that they began to invent what we know today as tourism. People living around the Roman Empire began to accept this story of the Galilean, and then Easter and crucifixion and resurrection, and they became Christian people. They wanted to come down here and see it. They wanted to see where it happened, and so there would be a church there for them so they could worship there and commemorate that place. So it oftentimes is a good way to get you to the site, and they found a church here. It's called Church of the Apostles. I'm pretty sure Edon is watching. He's been as I teach this, so he'll text me and remind me. But I'm pretty sure that it's the Church of the Apostles. And it's a place now where we know we finally have completed the arc, if you will, from Magdala over to Bethsaida. And I say that it usually works, but this is a good example of when it doesn't. I'll show you this too. That's just a piece of mosaic coming out of the mud. See, it's an active dig. They're still finding it. So it's kind of cool to see a church emerge, a very beautiful church emerge out of the rocks and the mud of the Galilee. That's the fun. That's the fun of what we get to do when we go over there. So it usually works, but sometimes it doesn't. So I took this picture. I've taken this picture from so many seasons, so many angles. Some of you who've been with me for a while, you know what this is. If you haven't been with me, I want you to just trust me, because I don't have an hour and a half to tell you why this is real. But it's real. Okay. Upon this rock, the Ark of the Covenant rested. Now, go home and watch Raiders of the Lost Ark, and you could say you saw it. You saw where it was. Okay, and it wasn't in Egypt either. So here's the story in 1 Samuel chapter 4 related to this, and then we'll tell you why sometimes the church doesn't work. Once they publicize this, you're one of the few Americans that have ever seen this picture. Once they publicize this rock will go in the Israel Museum, and they'll put a replica out there. But right now, it is the rock. 1 Samuel chapter 4. The Ark of the Covenant resides in a place called Shiloh in Samaria in the north. And the high priest Eli, we say Eli, but it was Eli, high priest Eli, had two sons who were total numbskulls, Hophni and Phinehas. The guys were just trouble ever since they were born, and nothing but trouble. And so these two dumbbells get the idea of taking the Ark of the Covenant into battle as a totem. Of course, why wouldn't they, right? That's exactly what they wanted to do in Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you remember, Hitler wanted to get it and use it as a super weapon. So they were going to take the super weapon into battle against the Philistines and then lose it. And it's such a calamity that when Eli finds out, that his children have lost the Ark, he drops dead. It kills him dead. He can't. He actually finds out that the sons die. He's upset about that. But when they lost the Ark, that kills him. That just knocks him dead. And so the Ark gets passed around amongst the towns of the Philistines, and everywhere it goes, calamitous things happen to them. So we're told in 1 Samuel chapter 6 that the lords of Ekron, which is a Philistine city about 3 miles from this place here called Bet Shemesh, they put the Ark on a cart with 2 milch cows, which means these are cows that have a calf. This is part of the miracle. I did not know this, but Edon knows a lot about cattle, because this is what they do at the kibbutz. If a cow has a calf, you cannot separate those two. I mean, you cannot get a mama cow away from her calf, and yet part of the miracle is that these 2 cows take the wagon, if you will, in a straight line to the field of Joshua of Bet Shemesh, where they put it on a large stone. That's the stone. Same dimensions as the ark as it's measured in the book of Exodus. Now, what happened eventually, and this is a little like a George Washington slept here, it didn't stay in Bet Shemesh very long. It went to another place called Kiryat Jearim, where it stayed for decades. But before then, it stayed here on this ark. And so what they think happened is that they took this stone and they built a chapel around it to venerate it, the fact that the Ark of the Covenant had been there. You know what I'm saying when I say the Ark of the Covenant, right? That means the Ten Commandments sat on that rock. The Ten Commandments that Stephen talked about in the sermon this morning sat on that rock right there. And that, you see that little black sort of strata there in the dirt? That's ash from the smoke of sacrifices and incense. So that's evidence that they worship there. There are two very large sacrificial stones outside of this chapel where they would sacrifice large animals and sluice the blood away. I mean, they obviously, for a long time, considered this to be a very, very important place. It was destroyed by the Assyrians in the invasion of around 700 BC. The same one that Hezekiah saved the city. The Assyrians did destroy this one, and it was covered up, never to be found again until the COVID disruption. It was found in 2020, late 2019, early 2020. Now, it's not open to the public. I did take a group last year who some of y'all got to see it. Now the hill has degraded to the point that it's very dangerous to get to, and we can't take a group until it becomes a park. So it may be by the time that it's seen by the public, they will take this rock and they'll take it away and put it in the Israel Museum, and we'll see a facsimile. Now, here's the crazy part. This is sitting right off of a truck stop and a busy road. It's just sitting right off the road. No, but the Ten Commandments sat on this rock, and it's sitting right off a busy road. And so Copeland, my son, and I, and Edon, we crawl down the hill, stumble down the hill. We're taking a picture of it. I'm not going to touch it. One, because I watched the movie. I know what happened to that dude when his face melted off. So no, it's just it has an aura about it. You just respect it. And this is not near the Galilee. This is actually southwest of Jerusalem, on the way to Tel Aviv, kind of halfway between. The town is called Bet Shemesh, if you want to look it up, which means house of the sun. But you won't see this. Nobody knows about it. So we're down there taking pictures of it, thinking about it, and thinking about what that means to be so close to where God's, something that God wrote with God's own finger might have been. And a tour bus pulls up. And I think, oh crap, they found it, right? Like I kind of don't want anybody to find it until everybody gets to find it. And anyway, that's just being selfish on my part. So the tour bus gets out, and they all walk right past us, and they look down like, what are those yokels doing looking at a rock? They're going over to look at a Byzantine church. They missed the point. Some church called the Church of the Glorious Martyr, built in the 5th century. I mean, I guess that's a pretty big deal, but it's not that, okay? And so sometimes a church can be in the right place, and sometimes a church can tell you absolutely nothing at all because the Byzantines built them everywhere. And so we watched the group walk by us, looking at the rock. No one asked a question. Everybody's having a big time talking about the Church of the Glorious Martyr, and then we just did this. Okay. It's really a marvelous. I can't show this to you enough because it's just an absolute national treasure. But let's go back to John 21 because that's not the only thing that happens. Okay, let's remember what we've learned so far. 2 clues. 1, the place is beautiful. Of course he returned there. Jesus is resurrected in Jerusalem. Jerusalem's not his home. People aren't friendly in Jerusalem. They're not friendly now in Jerusalem. It's a big city, right? Galilee is where you don't lock your door and everybody knows your name. Galilee's where his boys are. So you've got a clue in the text from the relationships. You've got a clue in the geography of the place. And now I want you to turn the page to John 21, verse 15. It's the final reason I love John 21 so much. When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he'd said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." And Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, someone will stretch out your hands, and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. And after he said this to him, he said, "Follow me." Well, I'm going to tell you. He asked him 3 times. He asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" Do you love me? Do you love me? Okay? Ask him 3 times. Anybody want to hazard a guess why I ask 3 times, do you love me? Because Peter denied him 3 times. Now, I want us to consider the story. Peter's denial is a story that only Peter could tell on himself. Nobody else would have known that story, but Peter could tell that story because Jesus undid the curse here on the shore of the lake. There's another scene in another gospel that is actually my favorite verse in the Bible, which is Mark 16:7, which the tomb is empty and there's a mysterious angel in the corner, and the angel says to the women, tell the disciples and Peter that he's going back to Galilee. Tell the disciples and Peter that he's going back here. Tell the disciples and Peter, meaning don't leave Peter behind. Peter's in hell right now. Peter denied me 3 times, and I gotta fix my boy Peter. I've got to fix my boy because he can't be Judas. He's got to be the rock upon which I build my church. Isn't it fascinating that the movement that was started, that became this, was started by someone who denied his best friend 3 times, cursed his best friend's name, threw his best friend under the bus. In other words, this got started by a loser, but God wouldn't let him go. Tell the disciples and Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? No one would know this story unless Peter could tell it on himself. I have my own history with this story, and then I'll stop and see if y'all have some questions. We all know how it goes, right? Jesus is on trial for his life. He's been slapped around by the temple police, and then Peter caves before the accusations of a serving girl. Many churches, we have not done this in years, but many churches will do this in the form of a passion play on Palm Sunday, and they usually give all the clergy the parts because nobody wants to do it. And so somebody gets to be a narrator, and somebody gets to be Jesus, and somebody gets to be Peter, and this sort of thing. It was at St. John's in Montgomery when I had just started in the ministry. Our Bishop, Glenda Curry, was a layperson, and then she had a part because she wanted to go to seminary, so we made her do something. And so the narrator said, and then Peter was a priest that we had on staff who we called Cracker because of his accent. He had the not worst Southern accent, but the most amusing Southern accent you've ever heard, and could just mangle the liturgy better than anybody I've ever heard. The wood and the Lord kind of thing. And so Cracker was Peter, and so the narrator, I'm pretty sure it was our bishop who's the narrator. She said something to this point: the serving girl could tell he was a Galilean by his accent. To which Cracker, in his part, he said, I said I don't know the man. I know, thank you. It was really one of the funniest things I've ever seen in church. But look, this is where they went, right? They went back home to where they had their own Galilean accents and their own friendships and their own ways. And my hope is that we can take the gospel back to wherever we're from, our happy place, our beautiful place, our workplace, our place of friends, our everyday place. Let's take the resurrection there. Amen. So if y'all got any thoughts or